Welcome to Friday at Ignite. So thank you so much for actually, showing up. It's pretty awesome when you got a room this big and everyone has plenty of room to maybe even take a nap or whatever they want to do. So what's awesome is I have enough swag for everybody at this point. So when you're interested, please let's get together afterwards and I'll hand out. I've got a couple of wireless USB chargers for your phones, maybe some pens, and we'll kind of talk about that. So welcome to Generation to Generation. My name's Jason Unger. I'm in the Azure Customer Success team, and I'm a senior product program manager in Azure. Our customers' focus, or our focus as a team, really isn't about a specific feature or a specific service in Azure. We're really kind of focused on, well, since everyone is over here, I can just focus over here. It's awesome. We're really focused on making sure that we help you guys kind of get the most out of the services that you're using. So one of my key projects right now is evaluating the amount of customers that are maybe running on Generation 1 hardware for virtual machines, and then helping them take that journey on what it might look like to move to either Gen 2 or even Gen 3 hardware. So I'm sure you heard about just a ton of new products and features throughout the week, and that's great, but if you're running Generation 1 VMs, you may not be able to take advantage of many of those cool new features, services, or capabilities. So we'll kind of dive into that. So when we talk about generation to generation, what does that mean? And as Azure grows in maturity and as Azure solutions have been around for a while, you've got customers that have been with Microsoft for some time. And many of the initial deployments may be running AV1 virtual machines. And as time goes on, the cost or the value of those machines is actually increasing. And the new offerings that are coming out at lower price points. There's also more density and better hardware capabilities that might allow you to scale up or scale out a lot better. So what we're really trying to evangelize is taking the time, getting into the Azure portal, taking a look at some of the VM pricing, and just evaluating those offerings to really see if you can maybe recognize some cost savings, if you can scale out, maybe use fewer virtual machines, or just overall re-architect your environment in a way that might be more performant. So in general, a resize is not that difficult. So what I'm showing on the screen right now is just a very, very basic example. So on the left-hand side, we have a standard A1 SKU. So if you're, say, for example, running an A2 standard, you're using just maybe an HHD and running, probably a limited number of cores. That's fine. And then we also have an A2 Gen 2 or V2 standard series. So what you might notice down in the bottom is we kind of play with the different sizes with regards to temp storage, but largely the number of cores and the amount of memory is pretty much the same. So while you might want to move from maybe an A1 to an A2 or AV2, that doesn't always need to be the case. What we're really trying to tell people is as they're looking at re-architecting or looking at new virtual machines is to consider all of the different families of offerings that are out there, because resizing really isn't that difficult. So make sure that you're taking a hard look at what are your actual hardware requirements. Are you sized correctly? Are you getting the most out of what you're trying to use? And then how do you re-architect or resize into something that may be more appropriate? So we definitely don't want today's session to be death by PowerPoint, so I'll just demo a couple of things really quick. A simple resize through the Azure portal. We'll also do just a resize of, well, great, Jason, if I wanted to resize one machine, that's really not too hard. How do I do that if I've got hundreds of machines or dozens of machines that I'm managing on a regular basis? So we'll run some quick PowerShell commandlets just to make sure that we can show that we can do multiple resizings, some resource group searching. And then finally, I've got a couple of peers from my engineering groups that have helped with either really large transitions externally or have actually done internal migrations from previous generations to next generations. We'll share some of our best practices and some of our experiences. And then finally, we do have time for questions. So please, if you're here because maybe you're thinking about changing up your infrastructure and you're interested in how to do that, come talk to us, ask a question. We definitely want to be an engaging session, so please don't be shy, all 10-ish of you that I think are in here right now. All right, so let me switch over to my regular machine real quick. And once we're here, you'll see me just kind of go through the tabs quickly. So I am logged into the Azure portal, and I've got 3 demo machines that are present. This is also kind of in my sandbox environment. So I don't know if any of you are using Visual Studio subscriptions or have Visual Studio subscriptions, but you do get a $150 credit if you're using the enterprise version of that subscription. So I'm literally just throwing some VMs that are associated with my Visual Studio subscription. What we'll do is we'll click on Demo 1, and instead of waiting for my load times, I'm just clicking across for the tabs here. So Demo Machine 1, just a basic A2 standard VM. So this is running on Generation 1 hardware with just a basic HDD hard drive. On the left side, you'll see that there's this option for size. And so if you click on that, that actually brings you over to a size screen where you have options of several different things that might be available or different sizes that will allow you to migrate in that specific region. So in this case, again, we're keeping with just the similar theme. I'm just going to move from an A1 standard VM, which is on Gen 1, to an A2 Gen 2. And all you have to do is click that. It's down here in the middle, already highlighted, and click Select. So of course, you'll start to get notifications in the top right-hand corner that says that that process is kicking off. And with any demo, some of these things take time. So we'll actually do the CLI migration or resizing at the same time. So in my PowerShell script, and hopefully you guys can see this okay, up at the top you saw I just did a quick get Azure RM VM. And what that's showing is just, hey, Jason, here are the VMs that you've got running in the environment. Then in the middle there, I've got a script that what it basically will do is go through, it's going to look for all of the resource groups that I have in my environment. Within those resource groups, it's going to seek out any of the A2 VMs that I'm currently running. If it finds an A2 VM, then it's going to resize that to an A2 V2 VM for me. So we'll go ahead and kick that off. And so while that's running, I don't know how many sessions you've been to that have also had a commercial break, like in the middle of their demos. So as we're letting these scripts and these resizes kind of run in the background, I don't know if you saw me on the Expo floor at all this week, or maybe members of my team, but we're really also wanting to make sure that we're evangelizing around a few tools and services that can help you when you're trying to find, well, where are my cost opportunities, or what opportunities do I might have for cost savings? So one of the tools that we are actually talking about quite a bit today was Azure Advisor. So if you're in the portal, Advisor is probably already a favorite on your left-hand navigation, and you're already opted in to have it kind of evaluate the things that you're running and what's going on in your environment. So if you've probably logged in the last couple of weeks, you may have saw that big rectangular box right in the portal that you may have just clicked through to get to your actual work for the day. But what we're trying to say is these are not general recommendations just that we're throwing out to everybody. These are actual recommendations that are customized for you, for the subscription that you're running, and in the environment that you're running. So in this case, obviously being a demo machine, I don't have a ton of recommendations, but what we're trying to do is help you understand, like, hey, you've got opportunities to maybe drive more high availability in your environment. There might be some security risk in your environment. Or in some cases, down at the bottom left, you might have some cost savings opportunities. So if there was a resize opportunity that might show up in the advisor, it would actually be on that bottom left side. So what we may recommend is, hey, we've been looking at the usage of this particular virtual machine, and it's not being used from the hours of 7 p.m. to 6 a.m. You might want to consider shutting that VM down and saving some money and then turning it back on when actual users are in the office and using the machine. The other recommendations that it might make is just helping you understand that a resize may also help save you money. So what I'd like you guys to do is when you get home and you get some time, make sure you click into Azure Advisor. It's available on the left-hand blade, and you can kind of take advantage of that. The other thing that we're talking about this week, too, was just the ability to set up custom notifications for your own environment on the software services that you actually care about. So many of you have probably gone to the Azure status page, and when you get there, you see a bunch of green arrows, and it kind of just looks like everything is great and nothing's really going on, but you might have a service that isn't quite acting the way that you want it to. You can actually use Service Health, again, already within the Azure portal, free to use, and you can configure custom alerts for any of the services or regions that you're interested in monitoring. And then you can configure such things as push notifications to maybe the Azure mobile app, SMS notifications, email, and you can do that within just a few clicks. So what I did here is I just created a very basic rule. And what this rule is saying is that if a VM service issue, maybe it's an outage of some type, maybe there's planned maintenance, that planned maintenance could also indicate that I want to do something, or finally, like a health advisory. So if something's going on with the virtual machines that Microsoft is responsible for maintaining for you, we'll send your team a notification, and you can then take action on that. After you kind of configure it, we do have this concept of action groups. If you're using Azure Monitor, you may already be familiar with action groups. But really on what we're doing here is just saying, if you have a team that is responsible for taking action on a specific task or a specific event, you can go in and from there configure hey, notify my operations team or notify my infrastructure team if this event occurs for this service. And so on the right-hand side, I just configured a basic, hey, FYI, email me if you guys are going to go down or if you have an outage, or email me if there's going to be planned maintenance. Finally, the last thing that I'm talking about while that script is completing is the Azure update page. So you can get there just by going to azure.com/updates. And I know you've probably heard dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of announcements this week. GA, now available. Check out this Azure service. That can be very overwhelming for everybody just trying to keep notes or maybe send themselves a quick text or send themselves a quick email. Hit up azure.com/updates. And really what you're able to do here is, again, filter to the things that you're interested in. So again, if you're interested in a specific Azure service, you can filter that update down to the things that you're interested in. But my favorite this week, and what I've been showing a lot of folks out at the booth, is the update type. And the update type specifically, we have all of the Microsoft Ignite updates that you might be interested in all in this page. So you can just scroll through, and hopefully you're able to find that thing that you were like, I was in a session and they mentioned something, and I forgot what it was. So we're really trying to make Azure Updates that single place of truth for you guys to go. And that way, if you have any questions about what's coming out, this should be your Bible. We do obviously have the other product pages or docs. Those will persist, but we just want to give you a single front door to help you kind of find that stuff. All right, so hopefully by now we should see that we have both of our VMs, VM Demo 2 and 3. So those were the ones that I did not resize in the portal. Those have completed. And then we have now, go back to our virtual machine page. Just do a quick refresh on this page here. One more point that I was going to forget. So even though I've resized the first demo machine, in order for it to take effect, a restart is required. So if you're going through that resize exercise, make sure you're kind of doing this within maybe your maintenance window or whatever planned maintenance you have. And what you're able to do is then follow your typical shutdown processes and do the reboot. But I do want to call your attention to, on the right-hand side, we can already see that the size has changed to the standard A2 V2, which is great. So we'll throw a restart on that, and then it will be running at that new size when we're ready to go. So those are kind of the demos. Again, just very basic, in-portal resizing, a resizing with a script, all good. And really what I also wanted to do was bring our engineering peers on stage right now. So I'm going to bring to the stage Amit Kamat and Fareed Dether. So I'll have them do introductions in a second, but I collaborate with both of them very carefully or very closely on a number of initiatives within Microsoft just with regards to helping customers either migrate off of the first generation hardware or in some cases even updating and redoing Microsoft services so that we can really just provide better services to you overall. So we originally had all the chairs on this side of the room, but since everybody's kind of over here, we'll orient this way, and hopefully we're good on camera and all that fun stuff. No, we're not good on camera at all. Yeah, way off camera. So we're going to sit here. If you guys want to move over, that's fine. If not, you can just listen in. But we'll just do some basic Q&A. So Amit, do you want to just give a quick introduction?
Thanks, Jason. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amit Kamat. I'm an engineering manager in Azure, working on the HD Insights. And my current focus is on making sure, giving customers a simple, reliable way to run their open source analytics software in Azure. And that's what.
Awesome. Fareed.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful conference. My name is Fareed Dether. I'm part of the Azure Capacity Management team, and Azure Capacity Management really looks after the planning and the capacity to make sure that you have the right SKUs in the right regions, so when you go to deploy your services, that you have a successful experience. In my current role, I work with our top customers, primarily across the Asia-Pacific regions, to ensure that their capacity needs are met.
Awesome. So I'll start with you, Amit. So one of the services that Microsoft offers is through HD Insight. It's just the creation of clusters and a variation of size. Can you talk a little bit about what is HD Insight and how can customers take a look at that and maybe use it?
So HD Insight is a fully managed, full spectrum big data open source service for running any open source analytics in Azure for enterprises. It's deployed in all Azure regions, in 30+ regions in Azure in public and national clouds. and the customers have a choice of choosing which VM SKUs to run and how big their clusters are and what SKUs to run. They can choose between AD or G series VMs, and they can run any of the open source workloads like Hadoop, Kafka, Spark, Storm, and a bunch of others.
Awesome. So that basically is a service that you guys basically procure through the Azure portal, and those customers can spin those on. Awesome. So Fareed and I were talking before we decided to do a session together, and he was talking about a specific project he was on with regards to an accounting firm. So before we get into the details of exactly the technical specs around that accounting firm, can you just tell us a little bit about what that accounting firm does and why it was important to engage with them?
I certainly will. So this accounting firm really built a software as a service for an accounting system, right? And they built it on top of Azure. And really what this software as a service did was it allowed organizations to run their back office accounting systems on their software. And it also provided other service providers like accounting firms with the ability to provide accounting services to their clients using this software.
Awesome. So kind of just continuing with that, can you talk a little bit about, I know we'll get to the, hey, here's the big migration, but before they migrated, can you talk a little bit about the environment and what finally brought them to the decision to maybe evaluate migrating?
Certainly. So they were primarily running the first generation of hardware on Azure because they joined onto Azure quite early on. So their entire environment was primarily built on the AV1s and the DV1 series. And as they started to increase their workloads, and they started to get more customers, and the dynamic nature of their work. So if you picture, if you will, the staff coming into work, the accounting teams, they start to spin up their day's work, their capacity needs increase, they go home at night and it decreases. And depending on the cycle of time during the business cycle, whether it's month end or quarter end, year end, their capacity needs dynamically change with that as well. So as their business started to expand, and as they started to add more customers to the base, they needed to have far more scalability, right? They needed to think about things which they didn't have to think about much before in terms of performance, in terms of manageability, in terms of making sure that their customers had an amazing experience with every interaction that they had with their software.
Awesome. So it really sounds like they were, after several years of using their existing solution, they were finally coming to that point where like, oh, we might need to just reevaluate what we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely, because you see, in their environment, they had a heavy dependency on SQL. They had a distributed environment where they had a front-end interface for the interaction with the teams and a component for doing all the calculations, et cetera, right? What we found, or what they found, is that as they were spinning up, upwards of 400 to 500 VMs on a daily basis on average, and sometimes into the thousands of VMs, that scalability became a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Amit, I know HD Insight made a few announcements this week, but before we get into how customers can take advantage of some of maybe the new offerings or capabilities that you deployed, can you kind of talk us through what the typical HD Insight implementation may have looked like last week?
Okay. So in HD Insight, if you want to come and run a workload in Hadoop, you go and create a cluster for your own, and then you choose the type of VMs that you want to run it on. So there are different types of VMs. We have worker nodes, head nodes in any cluster, and then you choose the VM SKUs for the worker nodes and how many worker nodes do you want. The same with you can choose the SKU for the head nodes or zookeepers, and then as it goes ahead, you will spin up a cluster with the number of VMs that you've chosen, and that's a typical cluster shape. And then as you choose the different types of workloads in there, you can run those on the clusters. We provide different SKUs in there. You can choose any of the A series, D series, or G series VMs in the creation.
Cool, and you guys are sometimes even making it easier for customers by just saying, hey, you can pick small, medium, or large, and then you kind of take the action on the back end to help kind of size that.
So for customers who want to choose, who know exactly what their workloads are, they can go and choose the exact SKU and the number of nodes. If not, they can choose a SKU which says like small, medium, or large, which will create the appropriate clusters. We map the small, medium, and large to the right SKU behind the scenes, and then we create a cluster for you. There are also other nodes where, which are like these management nodes, the gateways and stuff, where based on the cluster size, we automatically choose a SKU. And these were all AV1s, Generation 1 VMs last week.
So kind of continuing on that, and as we look at the announcements you made this week, so that's what we had last week for HD Insight, and as we look at what's happening this week, it sounds like you guys have gone through a resizing. So, when you were preparing for that, what were the SKUs that you were evaluating, and what were you trying to drive with the re-architecture that you guys are doing?
So just one more point, like if you see a standard pattern, there are two types of patterns. Like one, you have created a cluster, which a customer creates a cluster which runs for a long time. Or there are clusters where they have like these workbooks or automations where it goes and creates a cluster, runs your job, and then deletes the cluster. And this is like a part of a pipeline. So in that pipeline, if you've chosen the defaults for small, medium, and large, and we are creating these clusters, it would choose Generation 1 AV1 VMs before, along with the, when you choose small, medium, and large, right? And now, after the changes for small, medium, and large, we would now switch over to the new generation VM. So if you are running the same pipeline and the same code, and with your medium VM, if it was choosing A4 before, now it would choose a Generation 2 VM, equivalent VM, instead of that, and you'll get better performance and more memory on the machine, and it works.
Got it. So I think in this example, the cool thing about HD Insight and some of the clusters that they're running for customers who've just gone and kind of picked those default settings is this generation to generation concept. They're actually doing that for the customer. So when they're going in and they're creating those default values and they're sort of selecting the environment that they want, the migration has basically been done for them.
Yes, and for customers who have chosen their right SKUs and they have chosen the exact SKU that they want, there we are not making the changes ourselves. Like they'll have to, because they've already done the analysis and chosen a SKU for a certain purpose, so we don't change those. But the same for the VMs that are the management VMs, which are automatically chosen by default, where there was no choice, there we would switch over those to the Generation 2 VMs as well.
Got it. Awesome. So transitioning back to you, Fareed, with regards to that accounting firm, when you talked about the things that they had to consider when they were looking at or realizing that they needed a new solution, what was some of the preparations or plans that they needed to build before they actually decided to deploy an updated generation?
Fair enough. So given that they were on a very early generation and they had been on Azure for some time, this was a perfect opportunity for them to start to consider every type of VM that they were using, right? So identifying the right type of VM for the right workload was very key. For their SQL workloads where they had a need for high memory and high compute capability, one SKU might be better than another. So they had to go through and look at every component of their solution to identify what's the right SKU, what should we use, and how many should we use, right? And that allowed them to create a environment where they could scale up and scale down their services a little more dynamically and more effectively. The second thing that they had to do was to start to think about, as they were going to go to the migration, some of the planning, right? How are they going to actually execute this migration?
Right. So one of the things that you were talking about there was the different sizes that they may have had to take advantage of. So can you talk a little bit about, if I was running maybe 2 or 3 of the A1 standard SKUs and now I'm evaluating a more scalable, more performant VM, what might that do from a cost perspective? Am I going to pay more because now I've got this really big and really heavy VM?
Right. That's a very good question. As they started to look at some of these newer SKUs, what they found is that they're getting a lot more density within the SKU for that computing power. So when they went from a V1, say, to the V3s, they needed fewer machines to execute the same workload, right? So while there is some sort of a pricing difference between the first generation to second or third generation, they actually found that their costs went down because they needed fewer machines to execute the same workload. They were getting far better performance, far better scalability, and overall a better experience.
Awesome. So, as we kind of transition into, I think, what people are also going, it's like, great, they were able to go through the plan, they were able to find a VM that might work for them, but what are the gotchas? What are some of the key challenges that they ran into during that migration process?
There was two things that they really needed to focus on. The first was, how are they going to actually execute this migration? So are they going to set up a separate parallel environment and bring it up? Or are they going to do a big bang and shut down the existing service, do a conversion, and then bring it back up, right? And there's a lot of complexities to their services because they needed to make sure that they had consistent uptime. Right? Because they're servicing their customers. So that was a big consideration for them. Second was, since they were moving to new architectures as part of their migration, if they spun up new VMs and they wanted to make sure in production it was actually going to perform the way they did it in test, right? So they wanted to take that into consideration. Third is, when they were planning their migration, they wanted to make sure that they had to have the right quota for the right SKUs in the right region. So when they were spinning it up, there was no hiccups along the way.
Absolutely. So what did they decide to do? So if you're kind of at this inroads where it's like, well, I got to bring down my service that is supposed to be highly available for the customers that I'm servicing, right, versus, gosh, now I've got to increase. Now I'm paying twice for systems that I might not be using. Right. What did this customer end up choosing as far as their deployment process? Well,
for their deployment process, what they decided to do was they spun up a second environment. Right, so they created a new environment for their software on the new SKUs, kept the old one in place, and used a load balancer to redirect the traffic. So that gave them the ability to make adjustments as they were deploying. It allowed them to migrate their customers on their schedule and to shut down their own environment. And while it did increase their cost for the deployment, it allowed them to keep their business promise to their customers, right? So they had consistent availability of their service. But in the end, what they found is that they increased the effectiveness of their solution. They had better performance. So their customers actually realized that performance. They could see quicker response time. They could see their processing completing at a far more rapid rate. In addition to that, they reduced the amount of infrastructure that they were managing, right? They reduced the number of VMs. So they saw a cost reduction as well. So it was a win-win situation for them. Increased capacity, increased performance, and reduced costs.
Awesome. Thanks, Fareed. So, Amit, just back to you on the HD Insight transition that you guys are going through. Can you talk a little bit about some of the key challenges that customers who are already running an HD Insight cluster might experience if they're taking advantage of the new SKUs or working on?
For a lot of the new SKUs, we took care of the customer so that they don't see any differences.
Right.
But before we moved over the SKUs, we had like test clusters and stuff, which we used the same with the new SKUs, and we tried out all our tests to make sure that there is no performance or any other degradation. And what we noticed was there was better performance on a lot of these newer VMs. And it was also a cost savings to the customers because the cost for these VMs was less than the previous ones that we were using.
Right.
Even in a generic case, like if it's not just this, if you are trying to move over, it's always better to do that kind of testing challenge before you try to do that.
Right. So some of the things that you were talking about earlier when we were discussing the presentation was when you guys were right-sizing some of the clusters, you had in mind, like, we're going to run this specific SKU for this workload and this specific SKU for this workload. And then you guys, as you were running through your tests, you actually found that it wasn't as performant as you had hoped, and you ended up changing your plan. Can you talk a little bit about what happened and what you guys did to find out how that SKU was performing?
So what you do is, like in any SKU, if you're choosing, you want to check whether it's a memory-intensive workload or a compute-intensive workload, and choose the right SKUs based on what you think the workload needs, like how much memory, how many cores does it need, and then run those things. So when in some of our tests and in a different place, we found out that we were running on the workload on D-series VMs, which have good memory, and it was a memory-intensive workload is what we realized first, and then there is a lot of compute and memory both so on those D-series VMs, and we are running. And what we noticed after we ran tests for a long time is like it wasn't as memory intensive, it was more compute intensive. Right. And we wanted to migrate over, and we chose a different SKU for that purpose, the F series, which have more memory, more compute and less memory, and the workloads ran better there with fewer VMs. So the number of cores was the same, but we needed fewer VMs than the D series ones. And because of that, the cost savings was more because we needed a lot fewer VMs. And that made, like when you run the same tests, there was a significant cost difference.
So when I was talking to Amit earlier, that was one of my key concerns. It was like, okay, great. You saw that the D series wasn't working for you, and then you jumped to F, and I was like, wait, that series is expensive. What does that do for you, and how are you rationalizing that business decision to drive with a more highly costly VM? And that is the theme, and I hope you guys are hearing, is that in some cases, you can get away with running less VMs, and that math may work out to actually drive cost savings for your team overall. So with the last thing I kind of want to wrap up before we go to questions from the audience is, what recommendations or benefits do you often talk to customers about? So Amit, I'll start with you. When they're going through migration, what recommendations would you have for them?
So one is you need to decide whether you want to have a migration with zero downtime. And if it's a live service, you would always want something with zero downtime. And there are multiple ways to do it. One, as Fareed said before, you can have a parallel environment with the new SKUs, and then have a load balancer which will route traffic here, and then eventually move all your traffic to the new environment and shut down the old one. There are other ways where you could add different SKU VMs in the same environment, and you have still the same thing, and most of the traffic is being spread across by the load balancer in the same environment between the old and the new VMs, and then slowly decommission the old VMs once you realize that it's working fine. So that could be one thing which you also want to make sure that the software that's running is working on the new VM. You always do a test sandbox or a test environment before you go and change your production settings. In some cases where, say, you are going from smaller VMs to a lot of smaller VMs to few larger VMs, where the number of cores or memory is the same and you think it will work, but when you actually move it, you may see some other characteristics, like maybe networking is an issue or something. So you always want to make sure that you mimic the environment that's your final production environment in the sandbox, and test it with different parameters to find all issues before, rather than facing them later in the script. The other one more recommendation there is, you should always test like your SDK. So don't go and code for a SKU, because these machines will keep changing. They will keep evolving. You will get better, faster machines always. And then if you code and you assume your deployment is always using a fixed SKU, you'll have more changes later. So you should expect, when you are writing your configs or whatever, you should expect that things will change.
Yeah.
And you can, if you have, like, you can adapt to those changes sooner, it will be less costly to move over to the new generations.
Awesome. No, that's great feedback. So what about you, Fareed, on the accounting firm, which I think a lot of people can kind of relate to?
Right.
What are some of the recommendations that you've kind of come away with after working through that project?
Well, I think the biggest thing that was a takeaway was make sure that the planning is really well thought about. Right? The mechanics of making the change, as you've demonstrated, is very quick. Whether you're using a script for making large number of changes to VMs, or whether you're going to use the portal, the mechanics is very straightforward. But it's the thinking behind the mechanics of how you're actually going to make this migration take place, right? What SKUs are you going to use, and which ones are the right ones for your workloads? Making sure you do the testing, as Amit has talked about, to identify the right SKU for that workload and being able to adjust it. Ensuring that you have the right quota in the region for the right SKU. And I just want to talk about quota for just 1 second there. With quota, you go to a region, you select your SKU, and you ask for specific quota. And that quota is there to help the companies manage their spend so they don't exceed their budget, right? So when you go through and you request quota for a specific SKU, you may have 5 or 6 SKUs that you've requested 1,000 cores for. But you can also set a regional limit. So you could say, okay, for these 5 SKUs, I want 1,000 cores each, so that's 5,000. But I want a regional cap at 2,500. So that means you can use any combination of those SKUs to a maximum of 2,500. So when you're thinking about your quota, understanding your SKU limits as well as your regional limits is something that's very important. Second is your migration. Are you going to do the big bang, shut down and restart? Or are you going to be setting up a parallel environment? And what does your environment and your service allow you for? Third is, depending on your application, if you're doing a web service as an example, you may need to exist on one cluster, right? So if you're going to spin up your VMs and they're starting to land on different clusters, that web service may not have the ability to talk to each other, right? So knowing how you're going to be spinning up your architecture and then ensuring that you, when you're going to the portal, requesting that you be pinned to one cluster, so as you're spinning up the VMs, they all land in one logical space, that will make your service a little more successful. Okay? And then the last is as you're working with your partners, right, or with the solution architects or advisory teams, right, let them know what you're trying to achieve and work with them in that planning process, because that will help them work with you to establish that right solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the key theme that both of you have all talked about throughout this talk is planning is key, and taking the time to really evaluate what VMs will make sense for you, what those costs are, what performance gains you'll get, and what scalability you might achieve is really what you need to do before you get into the environment and start just deploying VMs on your own, right? And so that seems to be a consistent theme through all of the sessions that I've heard, at least throughout the week, is take some time, take a little bit of time up front, make sure that you're identifying the machines and the resources that will work best for you, and then lay out the plan to get there. So with that, I do want to call out a couple of things. So all of the bullets that we've kind of talked about throughout the morning here, we just left in the deck. So if you guys want to reference back to them, you can absolutely do that when you go to download or take a look at the deck after the fact. But there are some resources that we also put in here. So specifically the Azure pricing page. So you heard us talk about SKU this, SKU that, A SKU, B SKU, D SKU. What is all that? I don't understand. So the Azure pricing page will really help you guys kind of narrow that down and understand what we're talking about, see some of the different computing options that are available for that particular SKU, and kind of help you nail down what costs there are associated with them. The one thing that we didn't necessarily talk about is the concept of reserved instances. So if you believe these specific VMs are going to be around and living for a long time, you may want to evaluate taking advantage of reserved instant pricing, because you'll actually get a lower rate if you're locked in for a longer period of time. So there is some variation in the pricing that you'll see, but that's what that reserved instance is all about. You heard Amit talk about HD Insight. Check out their service. So I provided that link as well. You also saw me do the resizing with the scripts. So on GitHub, there's a bunch of VM scripts that you can kind of take a peek at, see which one may work best for your environment, and kind of tweak it in the ways that you want to see fit. And lastly, we did talk about quotas, and that can be a confusing construct or a concept for people to kind of get out of the gate. So there is a bunch of documentation on that I've also linked to, and hopefully you guys can take advantage of and find value in. Finally, the last three resources were part of my commercial break during the demo earlier. So Azure Advisor, Azure Service Health, Azure Updates, all great tools and resources for you guys to use and take advantage of when you're trying to just understand, hey, I need to know more about when the Azure teams may be going to impact my service, whether that's an outage, whether that's a planned maintenance, whether that's just a general service health advisory notice. All of those things, we're making large investments specifically from my team to make sure that we're putting more information there. And that way, if it's customized for you, you get the things that you care about. These aren't these just broad blast emails or something to that matter. The other one that's not on here, and I'm not sure if you guys have had the opportunity to take a look at yet, is the Azure mobile app. It's a great companion for your Azure administration. So I'm assuming that if you're in this room and you're listening to me on a Friday, you probably care about the virtual machines that you're running in your environment. And that companion apps allows you to do stuff like, quickly restart a virtual machine or restart a resource, from your couch when you're watching Monday Night Football or whatever like that. So with that, we can open up to questions. Does anybody have questions? And hopefully we can provide you with some helpful guidance or tips.
Hi, thank you for having this session. You're talking about moving from one generation to another, one SKU for another.
Yeah.
On-prem, we have the concept with VMware of hardware version, and we have difficulty moving to, say, an older version of the hypervisor. In a competitor, three-letter word I won't mention, they have 3 different image types, if I remember correctly. And you can boot the older image types on newer hardware, but you have performance penalties doing that. Does Azure have anything like that that we need to consider when we're moving from one SKU to another?
Yeah, I might have to take that one offline with you and get someone to. I know we have several images available that will run on all of the different families, but I don't know how those might be confined or restricted or even throttled depending on which node that you're running it on. But yeah, I'll give you a card and we can connect for sure. Do you have either of you have a card?
No, I don't have that.
Yeah, but yeah, let's talk about that for sure.
So with the image, do you mean that you have a specific VHD that you map the VM to, or like your own image, custom images? Because yes, so if you have your own custom image, there are ways to do that, at least from the base image, not the. So you take a dumb, like we can take it off.
Yeah, afterwards we'll talk about it and see what we can do. Okay. Anybody else? If not, I have goodies. It can be like trick-or-treating up here. So with that, we can conclude a little bit early. But hey, thank you guys so much for, I know it's Friday. We had a great night last night, so it's always hard to come to a session on a Friday, and I appreciate your time. And please make sure that you fill out the eval form. Let us know how we did. We always take that feedback, and we'll hopefully make the sessions better the next time. Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.